Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
This week, Georgia's Fintech Association presented some findings from the USAID and GFSIS joint study on global fintech best practices. What are some competitive advantages of Georgian fintech companies? Our reporter and analyst Georgy Aronia tried to find out for the checkpoints.
Along with the world's ongoing technological advancement, financial technology companies, also known as fintechs, are becoming more and more prominent entities. This affects not only the diversity of technological startups, which in the case of Georgia is indisputable, but also the level of readiness of the regulators. One could consider the report prepared by the Rondelli Foundation and USAID and presented by the Fintech Association of Georgia last week as the prime example of such a synergy.
With collaboration of Rondelli Fund and financing of USAID, we elaborate the findings of the best international practices regarding to fintech regulation. Our team, we worked approximately 4 months in past period, and we have identified approximately 15 best fintech regulation countries, which have maybe by our opinion most flexible environment for fintech development. We hope that our document will be a very good basis for the implementation further regulations for the National Bank of Georgia and other regulators, and we hope our opinion, our findings will be very useful for NBG, and it will be, as I mentioned, it will be a very good basis for the further development of fintech in Georgia and regulations as well.
We appreciate a lot all the research and papers that are done on this topic. Fintech is on the top of the agenda for National Bank of Georgia. It's also on the top of the agenda of the government. It requires joint effort and unified policy for the fintech sector to develop most efficiently. We will definitely use and benefit from the research that has been done. It has identified certain trends and directions that will be helpful to develop in Georgia. It also analyzes the good practice in other countries, and the more such papers we have, it's also, of course, beneficial for us, not only from the intellectual perspective for discussions, but also to base our policy in these reforms. As you know, National Bank of Georgia has very active fintech agenda. Our policy is based on several directions. So one pillar, we have increased our regional and international cooperation. We're also opening to the best we can the local market for the new entrants, and a good example of this is digital banking framework, for example. We also have standardized and unified the basic infrastructure. That's usually a bottleneck for the new entrants. A good example of this is open banking, where the tech companies and fintech companies will be able to distribute banking products through their own channels without the banking license.
Georgia, despite its small size and limited market, is quite saturated with tech and fintech startups. There is a very efficient and flexible banking system too. This is somewhat paradoxical because fintech companies usually appear and develop in countries where the banking sector is relatively bureaucratic and slow. This was one of the topics I discussed with the founders of the leading Georgian fintech companies, Kernel and Qualifica, who talked about the competitive advantages of Georgian fintech and open banking.
In terms of advantage that generally startups have over any kind of big corporations, especially in finance, is that they can move fast and they can make some mistakes that they can also improve on. So compared to the banks, they can direct their efforts to solving extremely narrow problems of the customers, of the niche customers, which banks address more widely. As I said, as they can move really fast, and as open banking is kicking in, I see more potential for cooperation between fintechs and banks, also because of the size of the market, rather than competition. So this is what I foresee for the banking sector and the fintech, more collaborative future, I would say.
Open banking was introduced in 2015, and the first countries was in Europe. And at that moment, European countries were not so proud of having very developed technological banks, and that's why it gave push for the smaller startups, smaller fintechs to develop some companies like Klarna. Stripe was in US, but similar like ADN, etc. And at the same time, Georgia is also following this path, and I think bringing fintech initiatives like open banking principles will be changing, but I can see that big competition will be occurring in Georgia coming from fintechs to the banks, because in Georgia banks are very developed into technologies.
Georgia could pride itself on a developed banking industry and booming fintech ecosystem, which of course gives rise to healthy competition between the two. This in turn creates additional opportunities for Georgian startups that expand to the outside markets. The research published by the Rondelli Foundation indicates that processes in the tech industry concern and interest the regulator too.
The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.